And so now we're going to shift over to our panel discussion on AI-enabled brain cell atlas knowledge bases. And in this panel, we're going to explore how we develop and deploy AI-powered knowledge bases that unify heterogeneous brain atlas data into structured and queryable resources. So I will quickly introduce our two outstanding moderators who will lead you through this panel. We have Shoaib Mufti, who leads the Data and Technology Organization at the Allen Institute for Brain Science. Shoaib and his team are responsible for Allen Institute's web products, knowledge graph, and integrated data framework, enabling advanced search and discovery of brain data. His team also handles informatics and data science using advanced algorithms, machine learning, and computer vision. Dr. Richard Scheuermann is the scientific director at the National Library of Medicine at NIH. He brings vast expertise in informatics, data science, and computational methods, coupled with deep experience in immunology and infectious diseases. So I will turn it over to the both of you to lead the panel discussion. Thanks.
So Richard, I'm going to moderate this session. First of all, thank you everyone for attending this one, and great presentation for Horek. And I think I will attending this morning session 2.1. I think a lot of things which were discussed here, we have been building a lot of those themes, so a lot of things were covered, so which is great, right? So we can continue a lot of that discussion. To start with, Richard and I will share a quick presentation and then we'll get into panel discussion. So let me try to share my slides here. So what we'll focus here, like a little bit of a like forward-looking look here, right? So there's been a lot of great work going on in Viren and other areas of NIH around building the knowledge bases. So what we are trying to explore in this session is what the roadmap looks like, what the path forward looks like. And it's really inspired, some of the themes which we have is inspired by NIH recently published Brain Native Research Roadmap, which John and I shared earlier on. So you see some of those themes here, also part of our discussion here as well. So the way we divided up our panel is in 3 sections. Just starting out, how to turn data into knowledge, what really a knowledge base should contain. The second section is around thinking of more like infrastructure side of things, how you kind of build this knowledge bases, what the infrastructure looks like. And then finally, we are going to talk about role of AI in knowledge-based development, because there's a lot of classical ways. If you look historically, people have developed knowledge bases through a traditional like knowledge graphs and all that. But AI is becoming a bigger and bigger part of how we extract knowledge, how we understand knowledge. So we want to explore that area. So the way we have divided it, there's a great panel we have, but we have identified a few lead panelists to start the discussion, the things are going there. So you can see like we have Satrajit and Giorgio in the first panel leading. Then we have David Haussler, Mollenkopf, and David Feng as the infrastructure panel leads. And then we have Partha, Jim Zhang, and Yuan helping us lead the AI of knowledge base section. But we have a big panelist. Like thank you for all the panelists and note takers. It's a long list. So all the panelists on this list, please feel free to jump in, or anyone else as well. And let's keep it interactive, because we have started with some sort of a seed questions, but we want to see where the discussions go. So please do participate and ask questions here. So Edlian showed a little bit of the slide yesterday about knowledge base. If you think about, there's a lot of like sources of information coming in, right? If you look at the whole landscape from obviously a lot of cellular information, Viren, then Brain Connects, Armaterium, there's a disease consortiums which are providing data. So our goal is to create more like a singular source of information, which helps to become a foundation, help in building the brain reference for neuroscience, but knowledge base will aid in that effort. So what is a knowledge base, right? At a very high level, right? If you think about it, like what we want to create is a one-stop resource for information about brain cell types, brain anatomy, connective function, and disease as we go along. And we want to be accessible um, to everyone. A big focus for us to it's easier to use, it's easier to consume, and there's a rich set of tools where people can search, explore, visualize, and apply knowledge to their work. Um, uh, so the whole vision around this knowledge base is just not like a what we call it a read system. You're just getting the information out of it, but you can contribute to it because we want to have this evolving community resource. I think the previous panel we did talk about, this not the big difference with knowledge bases. They're always evolving and changing and keeping the state of our current knowledge. So what we want to focus on, like, we want to unify and standardize neuroscience data across data sets, formats, labs, modality into a single interoperable ecosystem. We want to transform, we want to have the information that's trustworthy, tracking provenance and quality, so you can, at the end of the day, really trust what's coming out of knowledge base. I mentioned that it has to be easy to access. So I think a big focus on knowledge base is that how it's easy for people to consume. And then last but not least, like AI is a big part of it as we're going along, right? We are thinking about how these agents and foundational models become a big part of the knowledge base ecosystem. Um, so So if you start dig deeper, the key components around these things and dimension around is that, we want to make sure that whatever is in knowledge base can be reproduced in some ways. Some of the things like it's scalable and it's fair, right? Which we talked in the previous session. This is also important, and ultimately it helps in the precision biological tools. And you can look at some of the dimensions which are on the right side around. It's a dynamic infrastructure. It's very important to have a resource governance around it and pragmatic access as well. So I'm going to now hand it over to Richard. Richard, do you want to talk to the slide?
Sure, thanks, Shoaib. Yeah, I think, I view that this panel is really kind of a nice bridge between the focus of the previous panel on, the data resources that the brain community has developed and the kinds of future vision that Yuri showed in his presentation about how AI can kind of play a role of making sense of all that data that's been generated. Some of the, I think, concepts that come out of that kind of evaluation are reflected in this example of a knowledge graph that our group has been working on at the National Library of Medicine that's focused on trying to capture information about cell phenotypes in a knowledge graph format. And I think some of the principles that we've tried to incorporate were touched upon previously, and that is how do you capture the provenance of where this information is coming from? How do you link it to external knowledge resources using linked open data approaches? How do you frame the content of the knowledge base? What is the focus of it? Is that, and how can use cases drive decisions about what should be going into the knowledge base? And also the connection between data and knowledge, and how do we maintain those connections in these kinds of representations? And we tried to kind of incorporate that in how we're representing this kind of knowledge about cell phenotypes in the CKN that we've been building. Next slide. So in terms of the Brain Initiative, I think the goal of all of this discussion is, how do we develop a plug-and-play, user-friendly, and secure AI-powered brain federated knowledge ecosystem? There's a lot packed into that phrase, but I think each of the components are really critical in developing something that's going to meet the needs of the community. And part of that is transforming data into knowledge for discovery. I think that's the ultimate goal. But in order to do that, there are a number of critical challenges, like how do we standardize the data and the knowledge that's being represented? How do we deal with the incredible volume of data that we want to be able to transform into knowledge, and the complexity of that data and the knowledge that's derived from it? Some of the data is fragmented and it's hardly accessible, so that's a challenge. And then we have, this challenge of integrating cross-modality data sets into a common representation of biology. And then finally, how do we sustain the resources that we develop, and how do we grow them and evolve them as new data and new knowledge is derived? So I think these are a lot of the challenges that we're going to need to come to grips with to build out this kind of knowledge ecosystem. So on the next slide, we did put together some kind of seed questions for the 3 sessions that Shoaib introduced at the beginning. The first one, how do we turn data into knowledge? What do we want these knowledge bases to carry? Do we want them to have both data and knowledge, or just knowledge, or something in between? What kind of knowledge should be considered? What kind of use cases do we want to support with the knowledge bases? And what's the source of data that can be used to generate that type of knowledge? Is that already in BICAN resources, or is it in external resources? Where do we get that information from to derive the knowledge? And then how do we format it so that it can be loaded into the knowledge bases for use and query and exploration? And how do we ensure that the knowledge is trustworthy? I think one of the things that I view as a key feature of a knowledge base is that the information that's encoded in there should be trustworthy and reliable. And how do we ensure that? How do we keep track of provenance? How do we, how do we quantify the quality of the knowledge in the resource? So that's the first session. In the next slide, in the second session, once we figure out how to transform data into knowledge, what's the knowledge base infrastructure that we need to be able to set up user interfaces and tools that empower researchers to be able to explore the knowledge in the knowledge bases? How do we support the multimodal, multi-scale data ingestion and allow things like AI agents and large language models to reason across them? This challenge, how can the infrastructure actually help us overcome some of those challenges that I just mentioned in terms of standardization and volume and complexity, things like that? And how do we build this knowledge base so that it can federate with other knowledge resources, so that we don't have to ingest all the knowledge across the world into the brain knowledge base, but we have the brain knowledge base focus on the knowledge derived from the brain data, but then have a way of federating to other sources of knowledge as appropriate. And how do we make sure that the knowledge base remains current and auditable? And then in the final session, where does AI play a role? How do we build the knowledge base in such a way that it's an AI native foundation so that it can be used for generative reasoning and other purposes? How do we use AI not only to populate the knowledge base, but also to explore the knowledge base? There's lots of opportunities, I think, for incorporating AI throughout this kind of workflow. And, some other ideas about things like, how do we expose uncertainty and flag hallucinations and things like that, that also came up in the chat and in the discussions. So how can we, really take advantage of the opportunities that AI presents to help us build and interpret the knowledge in the knowledge bases? So we hope that can set the stage for the discussion. And now maybe, Shoaib, we could pivot to the first section and ask our panelists to provide their thoughts.
Great, Richard. As we're talking through it, I know one or two, there's a couple of presentations there as well, so we can have them chime in and share their presentation. But before we go there, Mike, you have your hands up. Do you have a question?
No, I'd just like to say, is it okay? I don't mean to preempt the first chosen panelists. I'd just like to make a comment if that's okay.
Sure.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
So I mean, I think this is we're fully cognizant of this, and I think it resonates with everything that's being said. But I just want to emphasize that I think that the concept of knowledge base, it suggests a kind of terminal application summarizing concrete or immutable results, something like an encyclopedia, right? And all science, and perhaps especially a field as complex and subtle as neurobiology, is subject to refined and refutable hypotheses. The roadmap, as John has said and Richard has said, is really does propose and emphasizes building foundation, scaling and integration of data. In this way, I think it's essential to regard data as a fundamental constituent of the knowledge base, and therefore tightly coupled with the data pipeline, standardization, and various kind of analysis tools. I mean, in this way, if we allow for refinement, correction, and advances in our understanding, it may be helpful to kind of consider explicitly defining, what we mean by knowledge and its relationship to data, right? I know that, of course, people who work in knowledge bases have been considered this, but I think the thing is that we have a tendency to think of this knowledge as something that is somehow different from the data, and I think that that's not entirely perhaps accurate. That's all.
I think that's a great point, right? Where the continuum from information, from data to information to knowledge, right? So, but you're absolutely right. This is kind of a blurry and really data a lot of time constituted as knowledge. So I think that's a great point. So maybe I'll invite a few people. So maybe I'll start with you, Satra, your perspective.
Sure. I'm happy Mike talked about what he did just now, because I was going to talk literally about that notion from data to information to knowledge as kind of an artificial construct that we create. And we really need to, I think about knowledge as things that we know or that we have come to know as a result of some scientific process and operations, which is continuously ongoing. And what we come to know evolves over time. And that's exactly where new experiments, new data. I still remember the early days of some of the processing would not do single cell processing. It would do bulk tissue processing. And now we have single cell and single nucleus and other things. And that evolution of technology has changed our perspective of knowledge. And kind of going back a little bit to Yure's presentation, his model is embedding knowledge as part of the training that it has performed. So kind of thinking about what knowledge is something I think we need to be clear about. We all kind of have thoughts on it, I think, in terms of what knowledge should constitute. But I think maybe we can flip the angle and say, how do we think about the precision and validity of knowledge and look at it through that lens? And this, I think, brings up the notion of trust and other things that Richard brought up in the introduction. Every instrument that we, I think, build, every new instrument improves some aspect of our ability to quantify and improve the precision of the information in the world around us. And that's turning some aspect of our observations into different kinds of data points contextualized by our thought processes that have gone into running an experiment, into generating data, and in scaling that up. Then there's theory and models that have led both to kind of the design of the experiment, but also what comes out of the analytics that we get out of the data that comes out. And we've already seen examples of that in the presentations yesterday from the BICAN data sets, the cell types, the variations in cell types, the differences across cell type evaluation across two different sets of data, the analysis towards building a consensus cell type based on the divergences and the aggregation. And that's, I think, the other part of what we think about knowledge. Each of those pieces are giving us new insight into things. And that's what a knowledge base should contain, with links to all the underlying data and the chain of processes that led to it. And I think we today may have the tools and the technologies, and I know some of this discussion will happen later on where AI and agents and other things can come in. Provenance tracking was always hard in science. because there's a lot of things that happen in all kinds of crude systems that we operationalize when we do scientific work. And maybe with the enablement of some of these AI technologies, we might start getting that linkages more firmly set up. There was a discussion in the last panel on raw versus minimally processed data. The fact that there is a minimal processing, somebody somewhere will either disagree with it or say that that's not a good enough way of doing that processing. So as a community, I think that is the kind of knowledge, whether it's operational knowledge in terms of designing of experiments, whether it's claims made from a scientific standpoint, or whether it's foundational references, whether through foundational models that Jure talked about, or some of the atlases we saw yesterday, that should constitute what we think of as the knowledge base. But the key to me, I think, is to have this as a read-write system, to go back to Mike's point. It's not an encyclopedia set in stone. We need to observe where we have disagreements with in this knowledge space. And that disagreement could come from observations in other data sets that weren't encountered in the original production. And to speak to Richard's point about ontologies and other sources, we as a community have developed a lot of things. And I think the key challenge with many of these things is how static they are. And that's where a lot of our systems and infrastructures often break down in dealing with change that happens as we evolve our scientific technologies, claims, hypotheses we are testing on those systems. So kind of looking through that lens that Owen talked about in the previous panel of what is immutable and what is mutable, and maybe thinking about that as a driving principle of what should be in the knowledge base. The immutability should be pointed to, could be served by other resources. The mutability should be observable and directly interactable and updatable in a knowledge base. So I'll stop there. Happy to chime in on many of these dimensions as the discussion progresses.
I just want to say one thing.
Thanks,
Satra, the figure that you showed early on in the last session, I think is very salient and summarizes this relationship pretty well, I think.
Yeah, thanks, Satra. Maybe we should be thinking about the data to information to knowledge as a continuum rather than these discrete chunks. And I think maintaining the connection for how the knowledge is derived from the information and data is, the important piece. When you're building a knowledge base, in some ways, we made arbitrary decisions about what we consider to be knowledge and what is the source data that we derive the knowledge from. But it was in some ways arbitrary about how we made that distinction. But yeah, great points.
And Richard, maybe I'll just quickly say, maybe turn it into a loop. Knowledge often results in what new data gets generated. And maybe that'll help us think of this as a continuum, but in a cycle that we can perhaps help shorten over time in certain ways.
Yeah. Jim.
Yeah, so that's a great discussion. I just want to share my opinion that I think in this loop, we should not forget about existing knowledge largely embedded in the literature, right? That's, we have done, a lot of research in the past, I don't know when the PubMed started, but, like 50, 70 years, and all the findings are reported in the PubMed. And when we say take this high throughput approach to understand the brain cells, we should not forget about all those details, past work people work on, gene by gene or phenotype by phenotype, a lot of work in the literature. And when we connect our data with knowledge embedded in the literature, leverage, say, large language models or agentic AI and other cutting edge tools, then that might be very powerful to enable us to generate the new knowledge from the data we generated combined with the literature, and have certain ways to certainly overcome the limitations of large language model and other things, and then to create the new knowledge for the knowledge base to share with people that can be used.
Thanks, Jim.
I think that's a great point. I think I also want to call on Giorgio, right? You have some thoughts you want to share. Yes.
Awesome. All right. So I've been asked to comment on these questions and specifically what we want the knowledge base to carry. And I'll offer my perspectives based on very practical experience with a knowledge base that we've created and linked to other databases and resources. And my perspective is a little bit biased on the circuit level emphasis here, which Partha touched on. And specifically, I start my quest on classifying neurons with the notion that the anatomical location of the axons and the dendrites is really a key defining feature, if not the key defining feature, to understand neurons in the context of their circuits. So this is slightly off relative to the emphasis on molecular sequencing that has been the main theme for this conference. But again, other people have discussed that, including David Kleinfeld earlier today and Dao and Kai. So ideally, we will be able to connect those going forward. So the practical experience that I will show has to do with the rodent hippocampus, but much of the conclusions that I will offer for discussion should be applicable to knowledge bases in general, at least with respect to neuron types. And the key idea here is that for many decades and in thousands of publications in the literature, neurons have been described morphologically based on the location of the dendrites and the axons in specifically anatomical parcels, so subregions and layers in the case of cortical structures such as the hippocampus. And then collections of knowledge of data have been summarized in reviews in ways that also describe the neurons in that way. So many years ago, about a decade ago, we started an experiment, so to speak, which is to try to see how we could put together all of these data into a knowledge base. And we created this system that we call hippocampum.org, which is entirely online. And this was over 10 years ago. And what we did is we took basically a representation of every neuron type in rows here and every anatomical location in the hippocampus in columns. So these are layers of subregions, dentate gyres, CA3, and so forth. And then we simply said, if a neuron has a dendrite in a given location, we'll mark it, say, blue. If the dendrite has an axon, we'll mark it in red. And if a dendrite has both axons and dendrites, we'll mark it in purple. And basically, every time we would see an instance of a neuron type described in the literature, we would allocate to the particular type based on this description. And of course, we rapidly accumulated many neuron types. We started with about 122, and basically that converged very quickly. And very interestingly, we could then layer additional data on those on this conceptual knowledge base. Very importantly, we kept all the source of the information, so all the raw data behind it, and very importantly, also the metadata with it. In this case, much of it was from the literature, but in many cases, the morphological reconstructions of the neurons, Neurolucida files or whatnot, were sourced by other databases such as neuromorpho.org, and they were linked in as well. So data, metadata, and knowledge. And importantly, one aspect of knowledge base is that you're supposed to be able to use inferences on it. And in this particular case, the inference is pretty obvious. If you have a neuron such as a granule cell in the dentate gyres, we act with axons in a given location, in this case, the hilus of the dentate gyres, then all the neurons that have dendrites in that location are possible targets of inputs from the granule cells. So this is an example, the so-called MFA Orden cell, but you can basically create the entire circuit of the granule cell connectivity within the hippocampus just based on information that you just put in the knowledge base. And with the same reasoning, you can create the entire circuit, in this case of the dentate gyres, and of course of the whole hippocampus. Then, because you kept the data and not just the definition of the neuron types, you can also take a step further and go back to the actual reconstructions of the neurons and say, now that we know that, say, neuron types are potentially connected, we can actually go to measure the length of the dendrites, the length of the axons, and the volumes of the space in which they interact, and calculate based on parameters such as button distance, spine distance, etc., the probability that they would actually connect, as well as the number of contacts likely that they would make. And by doing so, you can actually represent the circuit in a much more quantitative way that is amenable, for example, to network analysis, etc. And again, very importantly, it's key to keep those data, including the measurements of the lengths, etc., present, because other people might disagree with your assumptions. For example, hey, you used a spine distance of 2 micrometers. I have evidence that it might be more or it might be less, and that will of course change the results of your analysis. So the nice thing about a system like that is that you can layer additional information, which we have done over the years. Molecular expression is key, obviously, given the wealth of data that is being accumulated. I don't need to tell this to this crowd, but it also because it allows a direct estimate of the neuron type counts, so how many neurons there are in each type. But also we're able very directly to add information on membrane properties, firing patterns, which allowed to constrain computational models of input-output function, synaptic signals and plasticity between interacting neurons, and those required some normalization, which was dependent on machine learning and AI, but also information on phase locking with in vivo rhythms, and that allowed actually to connect with behavior and cognition, which are very much linked to in vivo rhythms. So the nice thing about that is that starting from a fairly simple definition of a neuron type, we're able to basically put together all the data that is necessary and sufficient to create spiking neural networks, and other people picked up on that and created models based on those parameters. So I'll conclude with just 2 main points that answer the questions that Shoaib started asking at the beginning. One is how to represent the knowledge. And I would say the key thing is to keep the knowledge model as simple as possible. So in this case, where the dendrites are, where the axons are, is very simple. You can always make it more elaborate as the data comes. But keeping it simple also allows to source a lot of data from the available representations. And the second, which is extremely important, is to keep the data and actually also the metadata in the loop, because that allows other people to reach different conclusions from yours, so to derive different knowledge from the same data, and also to augment, because the data always contains more information than the conceptual representation of your knowledge base can extract. So we'll stop there, and I hope I can see some discussion with these thoughts.
Yeah, Giorgio, I think you presented a couple of really nice examples about how knowledge can be represented in these different kind of graphical formats. And I was just imagining how we could translate that into these knowledge graphs that we have used to build our knowledge base. I think those are simple representations of the kind of information that you're displaying in those figures. And I think it would be interesting to see how that would translate. But those are great examples. Thanks. Yuan.
Thank you. I wanted to touch on the point of trustworthiness, because I think to enhance trust, the brain knowledge base must treat provenance, uncertainty, and versioning as the first-class objects, because every fact with an embedding or inferred relationship should be traceable back to the data sources and or the experimental context or the model's assumptions. So from large national AI consortia, one thing that I've learned is that without auditable lineage or uncertainty tracking, even the most powerful knowledge bases tend not to be trusted or reused. So just wanted to float that perspective.
Were there any questions in the Q&A? Oh, GQ.
Yeah, I was just reiterating or quickly restating the question or points I mentioned in the chat. There's in general a lack of unified formal language in describing knowledge. We have graphs, but those are closer to the model level, modeling of knowledge rather than language describing knowledge, in such as logic programming and other kind of formalized mechanisms. Location, temporal relationships. These are expressed mostly based on the data structure and knowledge structure they're embedded in, but not at a high level that is independently reasonable and have systems that can infer about and derive conclusions and infer inconsistencies and things like that. So description logic comes to something relevant, but there are other developments that I think point to the same need in the general biomedicine domain, where we don't have this kind of formalized language for describing, representing communication in a computerized and validatable way against the knowledge bases, against the data sources, so that it's descriptive. And even we extract knowledge from literature. How do you represent that? How is that captured? Do you use RDF or knowledge graph? Maybe or maybe not, but there should be an even higher level where that everybody can use and communicate such knowledge in a very precise, unambiguous way. So I'm pointing out the logical-based, mathematical formalism. That's the ultimate precision for reasoning.
Let's see, Jim.
Yeah, so the other thing I also want to add is that when we say from data to information to knowledge, but certainly I think we need to really also go beyond that with what is really a knowledge base, right? If you think about, is foundation model a knowledge base, or even beyond that, or is a well trained large language model that understand fundamentals of biology a knowledge base? So I would think that maybe our thought boundary should go beyond what we talk about the knowledge now, right? And imagine if in the end we have a large language model that really like a super biologist that knows everything. And in the end, that's what we were thinking, what we want from the knowledge base. So yeah, I think that's something also to think about.
Oh, yeah, I think there can be different flavors of knowledge bases, right? And they're equally valid. So
yeah.
Owen.
I agree with the last points made where it seems like maybe we should be refining our language about what we mean when we refer to a knowledge base. But I want to go back to a point that GQ is making, and there's also a thread that's happening in the comments, and ask the panel, do they imagine that a knowledge base is meant to be something that is an exportable object? Or is it something that it sort of resides in a database or in a schema somewhere, and that's really the role that it's supposed to be playing? Because I mean, there are big implications in terms of if we can expect that knowledge bases would be exportable and how we would be interoperating and designing ecosystems. So I'd just be interested in the panel's comments about that.
Maybe I could chime in a little bit on that, on Owen's question on the exportability of a knowledge base. I was thinking about this as Jure was talking about knowledge in an LLM. So I'm going to use that as an example and then go back to what we might think of as more traditional knowledge bases. An LLM is exportable in terms of its model weights and architecture, right? And we might say that there is knowledge embedded in that system in some way. We can discuss separately about what extent of knowledge, whether we can find it, etc. As a knowledge base, a traditional one at least, I think should be exportable in some form. Now, this goes back to, I think, GQ's question about the formalism around what that representation and precision around the representation. It's really, I think, a question of precision. People have developed many different ways of representing information over years, especially digital information, including logic, including notions that we ascribe to traditional knowledge bases. I think all of that is exportable, but this is where I think the ecosystem part of it comes down, that export may contain pointers to other things. I don't know if there's a universal encyclopedia of export. This was at least the dream of the linked open data model. We know there are some practical realities and challenges that go alongside it. So I don't want to get away from that potential dream, but I think in the reality of how exports happen, it relies on a set of trusts across a set of disparate systems, which we don't have a good established model for.
And I think, that also gets a little bit towards the notion of federation, that if we have a common format that the models are represented in, or the knowledge is represented in, whether that's for export or whether that's exposed for federated access, I think we need those common representations.
Yeah, I also just quickly chime in. If you look at federated learning models and all that, right, which is more in the AI world, right? But that's the whole idea. So I think the notion is more like, rather than export like federation, you share the things which you would like to share and federate at a central place, right? So I think that's the kind of trajectory, but that's a really good area to explore.
And I
Thank you.
think things like RDF and OWL are steps in the right direction. I mean, they have their problems and they're not, a complete representation of the knowledge that we would like to have, but they're not too bad, and I think that they're a good starting point for us to think about using. Partha.
Yeah, hi. Actually, if I open a textbook about knowledge bases, you will basically see first order logic, facts, reasoning, and so on. And one point I would like to make is that the ontology, the description logics, very popular quarter century ago. The only community that really uses it today is the biomedical community, whereas I would like to point out that description logics are only a fragment of first order logic. And we have a very widespread technology. You all know about it. It's called relational databases that essentially forms a model for first order logic. And it is one of the, just look at the company Oracle, right? We cannot forget that relational databases are a major, major way knowledge is represented in this world. Now, you can have NoSQL databases, et cetera, but it doesn't violate my point. Many biologists represent the data in spreadsheets, which are essentially tables. And then you have multiple spreadsheets. Now you have a relational database. So let's not forget that. But I want to make a point about this, data, language, and equations. So I think it's a pyramid, if you want, of knowledge. There's the raw analog data, if you want. There's things we say about it and we reason about it using symbolic language. And then if you're really lucky, like in physics, you get to write down equations where you forget the language. You don't need the language anymore. It's kind of become math. And that hierarchy, I think, is important, where I think we are lacking a little bit, because the literature is very much in language, in biology at least. There's not much by the way of equations. The data is not really there in the literature. You can try to pull out the pictures and so on and so forth. Nowadays, we have data. We don't have good bridge between data and language. And I think that's necessary. This is just because this is a symposium where we're looking forward. I think we need to develop these tools in a way the deep nets kind of, threw away symbols and went to vectors, which are analog things. But there are other people who feel that, no, it's actually important to either go back or bring back the structured reasoning. And it's kind of coming back in the LLM world, right? So I think this is the opportunity. There's data, the analog stuff, the different kinds of matrices, images, blah, blah, blah. And then there is what we say about it in linguistic terms or in database terms. And building those bridges in good ways is an opportunity that will help this whole discussion.
I think these are really good points. I know we have hands up. Maybe we'll take one or two, because definitely in the interest of time, we want to move towards the infrastructure section as well. But maybe we'll take a question here.
Yeah, let's take two more questions and then we'll move on to the next.
Right.
Valentine.
Yeah, hi. Yeah, so I think probably first state like what I think of as a knowledge base, because we might have different ideas. And I view it as basically a database with statements that we have very strong evidence for, that you can link together through an inference engine, essentially, which ends up being like a SQL lookup in the end if you have a lot of good statements that you can tie together. And I think a good thing to think about, where we were talking about earlier, validation of the different statements we would have in such a model. And I think we can take inspirations from the reasoning model world in the machine learning world at the moment, where you can perform a data split on your knowledge base because you probably have statements that can be arrived at through different paths throughout the knowledge base. So if you do a split, then you can see like, okay, we leave out these different statements. Can we arrive at them through the other statements we have in the model? You can see consistency of your things. And so that was something I just wanted to bring up, this data splitting thing for these kinds of models.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. All right, Tyler, it looked like you took
Richard,
your
could I ask
hand
Valentine a
down.
quick question on a comment that he made? Just a quick question.
Sure.
Sure.
He mentioned about that has strong validation. Should that be a threshold for getting into a knowledge base? Or
That would be
should we
my
allow
that
for
would be my
different levels of
distinction.
validation?
No. So yes, I mean, I would view this as like a big thing of like scientific results, and then you on each scientific results you put like a certainty that is difficult to arrive at. But imagine you can put a certainty all over them, and then someone has to decide what is the threshold that puts it into the knowledge base. So knowledge base, in my opinion, should be a bit more curated than generic results.
The way that we've approached that question in ours is we have the bar relatively low for bringing things into the knowledge base so that we're kind of inclusive, but then we're capturing quantitative measures of confidence so that you can filter the edges and the nodes based on how stringent you want to be. And then we also try to track situations where the same assertion is being identified from multiple sources, and that's additional kind of validation for a knowledge assertion. So, but yeah, I mean, it's a thresholding issue, and I think there are different ways to approach that. Shoaib, should we move on to the next topic?
Sorry. Yes, I think we should move on right now. Infrastructure section. So maybe I know the screen gets a little blurry when we're moving around. So maybe I'll start with you, Tyler. How will we build user interfaces and tools to empower researchers and developers to explore, build, and share the knowledge base as a core discovery tool?
Yeah, thanks, Shoaib. I'll share a few thoughts on this. I actually dropped my hand from the previous because I thought maybe I'd just share a quick comment here as by way of transition, which is, one way to constrain some of the complexity in thinking about what is knowledge and is to be user-oriented. And that's a good segue into this question of, knowledge for a purpose requires somebody to do that purpose. And by talking to users, by being grounded in what they are trying to accomplish, we can, I think, simplify some of the otherwise very complex abstract space around the data to knowledge spectrum. And for example, that matters a lot if our users, as they are in the near term, are primarily people doing foundational research and translational. What knowledge means and how we organize all of this information is going to be different than if we want to put this knowledge base into a clinic where someone's actually making medical choices for a real human being. So being user-oriented, I think, can help us navigate some of this complexity. In terms of the user interfaces and tools, first I'm going to maybe share some thoughts on kind of key requirements for those capabilities you mentioned, Shoaib. For exploration, user interfaces need to empower scientists to fluidly move across this spectrum we've just been discussing between data and knowledge. And that's not a discrete spectrum in reality, as we've just been discussing, but we need to make it discrete so that people can navigate in some ways. That's I think that's valuable. And that applies across search, across browsing, and also when people get into deep visualization and mining. I like to think of this as a zoom in and zoom out experience. So you zoom out, or so you zoom in to scrutinize and to analyze further. You zoom out to get context and background on something. So for example, if someone's on a knowledge card for the tail of the caudate, they should be able to zoom in and visualize some data set from that brain region if that's of interest to them. Or what's the data, what are the images that defined the tail of the caudate with this sort of parcellation in the first place? Or alternatively, if a user is deep into a particular data set and they see a bunch of cells labeled by a cell type that's unfamiliar to them, they need to be able to zoom out instantly to a knowledge card about that cell type and get more context. Conceptually, that's pretty simple, but building a user interface that remains that simple, even as they're working deeply in a data set and need to zoom out or so on, that takes some care and user testing. In terms of building this knowledge base, there's a few areas I think we need solutions, for handling data at the archives or the data commons more generally, for dealing with new models, and then for dealing with new analyses. We talked a lot about the data commons earlier, but maybe one thing I'll emphasize is the need for the bidirectional links between archives and the commons and the knowledge bases, so people can go back and forth. For models, these are going to need standard metadata just like all the data does. And I think the user experience to find and work with these models is going to benefit a lot from something else we talked about earlier, from benchmarking. The clearer we are about the benchmarking tasks that are understood and available and used, the easier it is for people to find the models of interest, because they can say, I'm trying to do this task, or I'm interested in things that are good at this, and that enables better search and finding. So those benchmarks are not just good for this, for the communities developing those models and understanding, are they moving forward, but also for people sort of finding and making use of them, not just building them. And then, analyses are going to come either from traditional pipelines or application of these new models. And one really important thing for those people building those is a very simple workflow for them to indicate the data out in the commons at whatever archives that they used to do that analysis. So we can, again, build that link between the commons and the source data and information in the knowledge base. For sharing, I think there's two broad things, sharing elements in a knowledge base, sort of views online. That requires web applications to preserve their state really diligently and expose that through some URL. Sometimes those URLs can get long, as in our ABC Atlas or Neuroglancer, but there's ways around that. But you got to put all the information into state so you can share visualizations and work easily. For sharing data sets or other artifacts, DOIs are a good technique here, but we need globally unique IDs for each and every piece of information in the knowledge base, so that as you're sharing outside of kind of the closed software system, we don't lose the context about what something means or where it is. The other sort of sharing is sharing your, the community information out through the knowledge base and into it. And there's a few complications there, but one I'd highlight is quality. Really robust knowledge base infrastructure is going to need scalable methods for evaluating quality, using quality assessment to influence search results, and then present those quality control metrics to end users. We take some of that for granted talking within the BRAIN initiative, where there's a well-funded body of research from world-class institutions. Some of that comes for granted, even though, of course, there's quality control done at each place. But when we open this more broadly to anyone in the community, that we need that to be really scalable. So those are some of my thoughts on requirements. The last thing I'll mention briefly is not so much the what of what we build, but the how. And the thing I want to reemphasize there is to be very user-oriented in our development process. We need multiple channels open for people to disseminate to and to get their feedback. We need to prioritize user feedback alongside whatever other strategic priorities we have and take actions to address those. One simple example I'll share from the tool we've released at the Allen Institute, Map My Cells, for getting cell type labels on your database from transcriptomics. And we started thinking, user input's going to come, people are going to submit their data in AND data files. That's a really common basic way to work with this sort of transcriptomics data. But based on user feedback early on, people really needed to be able to submit data through CSVs. Maybe they had a really small number of genes or a small number of cells. They were just used to working with CSVs. That introduced some other kind of data compatibility, validation needs. CSVs inherently don't have the structure we could rely on within data. But dramatically increased usage and satisfied, sort of users' sort of main pain points even for getting up and running. That's a very small example, but one where initial assumptions we had, especially based on working with some other experts at the Allen Institute, were invalidated when we went to the broader community, and we needed to take some steps to adjust and make sure everyone could use it.
Great, Tyler. Thanks for this perspective. So one thing I just want to also explore a little bit here with David Haussler, if you're here, about the cross-model integration, because that's one of the big challenge for any knowledge bases. So David, if you have any perspective on that.
Well, my perspective is that we have an infrastructure to build. I think we have some great examples in other areas. I'm going to use the genome browsers as an example of unifying knowledge over different experiments and different types. So in that case, we have the advantage of having a common coordinate framework, which was the coordinate locations in the genome reference sequence. Here it's more complicated, but I still think we need to have a common coordinate framework. And I want to shout out to Edleen and you, Shoaib, about just to say that the work that you're doing at Allen on building the common coordinate framework is incredible. I know you have many collaborators outside as well. I would envision an entry point for hanging knowledge that we could then dynamically explore from as a starting point would be actually a 5-dimensional structure, essentially the 3 space dimensions plus a dimension of developmental stage, and the 5th dimension being scale. So to be able to actually hang data on cells and subcellular organoids, even down to molecular subcellular features, even down to the molecular level and up to the tissue level. We saw actually some beautiful work from Giorgio earlier, and I think if we're going to connect with the work that's done in connectomics and other areas, with some of the MRI work and so forth, we want to have a system where we can all find a home, a point in some actual, real, biologically significant place. Now, of course, the cells that are in here will be idealized cells in idealized locations with idealized neighbors. You can't really explicitly talk about all 85 billion neurons as individual units, but I think we can still have a version of this that works well. And there was some great earlier discussion about coordinate maps between species as well, and we fully want to exploit that. This is kind of like a liftover feature that we have in the browser for jumping between genome coordinates in different species, and that has performed very well for us. So I hope that we will have a way that we can anchor data so that we can all be all converge on a point of entry and a point of query. But the actual data will live in this high dimensional space that Yuri described. And I am incredibly impressed with the performance of universal cell embedding. It really is opening up a new area of knowledge representation. These foundational models, not just the UCE, but others, again, are providing an extraordinary way that we can represent data in a high dimensional space instead of in a hierarchy or a graph or other formats that lies underneath and is operational. By operational, I mean that you can map your data to it directly and you can make inferences in it. So let's, again, to reiterate some of the points that Yuri made, it's an abstract space in which different data types can map into a single position that then is associated with neighboring positions that can have annotation with them. What we want to do is to do something like Yuri's model, but much more multimodal. So Yuri's model has single cell information. It has protein structure information, but we have many other types of information that can come in as data. And I want to echo back what Trey Ideker was saying yesterday, that you really need to be able to map data into this in a way that that allows most of those data input coordinates to be missing and to be inferred. So we really want to have a common space for viewing multimodal data that's trained on data that includes missing values and nevertheless can impute those values. And that will be an engine for inference that will be a primary way of us actually doing scientific investigation. This is something that, again, it's not an absolute done deal. It's something that will have to evolve in versions over the next years. But when it's available, it will be extraordinary. And I think it can link the different types of data. In particular, the epigenetic data will be incredibly important. The model itself will incorporate multiple data types, multiple modalities of data, but not necessarily be required to have all modalities in each training example. That's the fundamental desideratum for this. Now, the third part that we have in browsers, and this is the last part of what I'll say, is that we allow third parties to be able to add tracks to the core data structure. So in a genome party, third parties map their data directly to chromosomal coordinates, very unambiguous. And for some brain data, this is possible with the common coordinate framework because the data is fundamentally anchored to some spatial position. But many, many data sets don't have that property. And so they will be mapped through the foundation model. So this is, again, something like the UCE, a pre-trained foundation model that is able to impute things. And one of the things it will impute is what type of cell and where am I likely to be located. And that will be the indirect way that it will be spatially mapped into what the user interface might look like, which is a 3D image of the brain in some sense. That in turn links out to all of the other databases which contribute complementary information. And so if we can channel things through both the high dimensional space of an AI-based foundational model and the 5-dimensional space of our thinking about actual brains and how they develop at different and how they exist at different scales, if we can unify those two, I think then we have a very huge leg up on how to actually provide a foundation for future scientific work. It's interesting that in all of this, the other part that's come up in this meeting is very important, that we want to get to mechanism and we want to include perturbation data. This next phase in driving towards mechanism and including perturbation data would be built on top of what I was just describing. And these tracks come in very, very importantly because other people can add tracks that start to point to mechanism, whereas the foundation model, the UCE, does not reason, so to speak, fundamentally from mechanism. But mechanism can be overlaid on this and interact in that high dimensional space in a very creative way. And I'm extremely excited about that. I hope that's not too abstract a comment, but I can very much see an enormous potential. But I think we greatly underestimate perhaps the amount of data we would need to get to that point where we have a predictable model for perturbations in a mechanistic sense. I think we're off by several orders of magnitude. I really think we need a very strong data acquisition program informed by our success and limitations that we find in this program that will create essentially perturbation data from billions of tissue samples. And you can't have a billion mice. You can't really do perturbations in natural people. I think we will need a sophisticated organoid model that will supplement and fill in some of the gaps in these incredibly large data set that will be needed in the perturbation space before these models actually start to work. We saw from the ARC challenge that they have a long way to go in terms of predicting the effects of perturbation. And Paola, I want to again reference to her. She pointed this out vividly earlier on here. But once we have these multiple tracks and we start overlaying tracks that have a mechanistic interpretation, we can have this virtuous cycle interacting between the fundamental high dimensional representation of our data and its manifestation or its hooks in terms of this nice common coordinate frame, and then crank on that. And it will be incredible, I think, in terms of an opportunity. And in terms of having absolute truth, we can't worry about whether we are absolutely true or trustworthy until we actually build this thing. And the best thing we found in the browser for getting at truth was to compare tracks from different labs who were making similar predictions side by side and having that available. The UCSC genome browser was never was never set up, and we never attempted to be the party that just decided on truth. We displayed the data in such a way that automated programs as well as individual browsers could figure out what they see as truth, because the inconsistency when it existed was apparent. So I think build something, and I think we want to build something light touch and small. We want to start iterating on this. I would like to see common coordinate frame, even if we have to map from mouse back to human, as soon as possible, so we can start iterating on a design like this. But I would say I am incredibly excited about what this consortium could do. Absolutely revolutionary, and your timing is perfect because the AI is bringing incredibly powerful tools to support this. Thank you.
Great. Thanks a lot, David. Great perspective. Really appreciate it. Mike, you have your hands up. You have a comment on this?
Those were fantastic remarks, David, and a great overview. You know, I just wanted to just add one other thing, was that, you know, that there's not one knowledge base, right? There's going to be many people, especially with the new NIH initiatives, there's going to be many people creating, you know, different kind of instantiations. And, you know, our experience tells us that these are not going to be integrated very well initially. And we have to prepare for that. And I think we need to build, you know, the tools and the resources that enable some sort of roadmap for interaction of these different kinds of resources. Because, you know, Richard, you're doing something, the other people are doing something, and there's going to be both healthy competition for these resources and, you know, different kind of trajectories. And so this is something to think about, I think.
Absolutely.
I think that's a great point. I just probably have a final comment in this section, and then we'll move on to AI in the interest of time. So David Feng, can you give us some thoughts on data ingestion and all that, the infrastructure work you have done there?
Yeah, sure. I'll try to be quick in the interest of time. I think the infrastructure we're working on at the Institute for Neural Dynamics is mostly designed to be useful for AI agents by default, like to think of it as the first-class citizen when we're thinking of who our users are, right? And you know, I want to echo what Marianne said a few different times earlier today. We think about humans as users. What do we need to understand and interpret data effectively? That's actually just metadata. It's rich, deep metadata, right? And my view is that's actually equally true for AI agents as well. And so great, the fair data principles don't really need to change. The only modification we need to make is we need to take much more seriously thinking API first, right? Develop APIs that are programmatically accessible and well documented, so that you don't have to have a human explain how to use something. And so if I'm thinking about multimodal data, so in the neural dynamics part of the Allen Institute, we collect data that spans in vivo and in vitro experiments and assays. And so I have to think about metadata that spans basically all of neurobiology, right? I don't get the luxury of focusing on one modality at a time. And so I think this is something that the community should take much more seriously. We need to have a mandate to think across all the different kinds of data that we're not currently thinking about. The other point I'd make is a little bit of a tension with what Mike just said. Yes, there will be federated systems. It's baked into the system, but that introduces a huge amount of friction. And one place we could try to reduce friction is at least try to get the metadata in one place, right? If there was one API that described all the data and people could search it there, that would be incredibly useful. I'll jump back just a minute to talk about how we prepare data for model trainings, maybe more appropriate for the earlier session, but I'll just say my piece here. We need to stop asking people to shuffle data around in bulk. And I think this really boils down to aggressive standardization around multi-scale file formats. There's some chat about this in the background. So we love OMEZAR, we love NWBZAR. So we need pipelines and tools that lean into these formats. And then finally, just final thought is, when we're training models, oftentimes we provide metadata to these models as context, right? If I want to know what type of a cell it is, maybe I want to tell the model, I want to give the model a hint, right? You're in this brain region, or that kind of thing. I think we really need to take much more seriously providing all the metadata I just referred to before as context to these models. We do a lot of sort of feature fishing when we're deciding what we think is going to be the thing that the model needs to use to make a decision. And I don't think we need to do that if we take metadata much more seriously. So I'll let us move on from there unless there's discussion.
Yeah, great points, David. I think the multimodal data, especially, and the metadata are very important. We need context. And you can impute well. If the whole idea is these deep representations, these high-dimensional representations can impute, but only if they have the right context.
It's just, especially in the context of, in vivo behavioral experiments, there's so much context missing. So we need to push.
Yeah. And I think if we start thinking about a subset of the metadata as defining context, we'll take it a lot more seriously.